Oh, yeah, sure. Doing great work. You're doing great work. Very impressive. It's going to recommend to you. It turns out another Spanish publisher got to it before we did. You know, a new publisher called Ediciones Tormenta? Okay. Yeah, I have a PhD student wrote a book about mutiny, 1790s, the British, Dutch, Swedish, and Dutch navies. He has all the languages to study these archives. It's really excellent history for learn. I wanted you to see it. Well, yeah, I'll let you know.
Gracias a todas por venir hoy al primero de los dos actos que vamos a tener con Marcus, que organizamos desde la editorial Traficante de Sueños. Es un placer para nosotros contar con él hoy aquí. Sí. Tendremos hoy lunes, estará Marcus con nosotros presentando La Hidra de la Revolución. También nos acompaña Wendy, que estará también el martes en una sesión con las compañeras de Nociones para hablar de su libro. Y el miércoles también volverá a repetir Marcus para hablar de villanos de todas las naciones. Bueno, Marcus no necesita mucha presentación, profesor de Historia de la Universidad de Pittsburgh, autor de numerosas obras, entre ellas en esta casa, está publicada La Hidra de la Revolución, escrita junto con Peter Leinebaugh, y también Villanos de todas las naciones. Ha escrito también otras obras que están traducidas al castellano, serían Un barco de esclavos, publicado... ¿Se oye fatal? Sí, va a probar la compañera del fondo a ver si se escucha un poco mejor. ¿Así? Igual soy yo que no hablo muy bien, ¿eh? No, a veces no es cuestión del sonido. Bueno, pues con Capitán Swing ha publicado Un barco de esclavos y con Antipersona, Entre el deber y el motín. Bueno, publicado no traducido. Sin más, vamos a aprovechar que las compas de Nociones han hecho un grupo de lectura este verano sobre las dos obras, tanto sobre la Hidra de la Revolución como sobre Villanos de todas las naciones, y le hemos pedido a nuestro compañero Pablo que haga una breve introducción y después daremos la palabra a Marcus para que hable sobre el libro y luego poder tener un rato de charla y debate con él, ¿vale? Sin más, le doy la palabra a Pablo y que disfrutéis.
Muy bien, pues nada, muchas gracias a todas, a todos por venir. Me lo voy a alejar un poco porque me digo muy fuerte, y especialmente a Marcus, a Wendy por pasarse estos días por aquí, por Madrid, y bueno, pues poder debatir y presentar también estos dos libros que tenemos editados, otros muchos también que hay de Marcus Rediker aquí en castellano, y bueno, como decía Paco, a partir del curso de Nociones Comunes de Villanos de todas las naciones, pues exponer un poco también el porqué, la importancia de este libro, ¿no? Realmente en el contexto del Estado español, los debates históricos que llegan sobre todo al gran público, por desgracia, están siendo conquistados por la derecha, y me atrevería a decir por la extrema derecha. Es decir, se echa en falta desde hace muchísimas décadas una escuela de historia militante que tenga una capacidad de intervención pública, una capacidad de organización pública, una capacidad también de poner encima de la mesa otros puntos de vista de la historia, de lo que ha sucedido, y eso ha llevado, pues evidentemente, a que ya lo hablábamos antes con Marcus, pues escuelas de historia relativamente pobres en nuestro contexto inmediato, ¿no? Precisamente el libro La Hidra de la Revolución, yo creo que es un capítulo más de toda una construcción de un modelo, una manera de hacer historia que tiene que ver con la historia popular, que tiene que ver con la historia desde abajo y que tiene que ver también con una historia del proletariado muy distinta a la que se suele leer en el contexto español, ¿no? Viendo el año pasado algunas cosas para cursos, nos podemos remitir, por ejemplo, a los famosos debates que se dieron en la primera New Left en el año 64-65 entre Thompson y Perry Anderson. Esos debates tienen como origen un texto de Perry Anderson que está intentando hacer un balance de cuál es la forma del Estado inglés y cuál es la forma también de una posible revolución inglesa, y para hacer eso se remontan durante varios siglos a hacer una interpretación bastante profunda de lo que son las estructuras industriales, las estructuras económicas y las estructuras sociales de Inglaterra. Eso en el caso español sería absolutamente impensable. Es decir, la historia en nuestro contexto y la vinculación de la historia con la política en demasiadas ocasiones está muy atravesada por el marco cultural y coyuntural del presente que se suele reducir en demasiadas ocasiones a una mera disputa entre izquierdas y derechas, ¿no? Es decir, entre las lógicas del progresismo y las lógicas del derechismo, si se quiere llamar así. Eso pasa, por ejemplo, en casos muy concretos, salvo importantes excepciones de investigadores e investigadoras militantes, con el caso de los comuneros, ¿no? Es decir, en la cuestión de las comunidades, las revueltas de 1521, 1523, se ha querido interpretar la revuelta comunera como una revuelta de inicio del liberalismo, del inicio de una protodemocracia liberal, sin atender en demasiadas ocasiones precisamente a lo que sí atiende la idea de la revolución, que son las tradiciones de radicalización política, las tradiciones de radicalismo político popular, las herejías y, al fin y al cabo, un punto de vista que permita pensar desde otro lado eso que se ha venido en llamar la historia desde abajo, desde el punto de vista de los movimientos populares, ¿no? En el caso de la Escuela de Annales en Francia, o en el caso sobre todo de los marxistas británicos, hay todo un rico abanico de conceptos que van a investigar sobre ese elemento. Es el concepto de experiencia N.P. Thompson, que mil veces se ha tratado, es el concepto de percepción que tiene Georges Lefebvre, sobre todo en la Revolución Francesa y sobre todo con ese libro pionero en este ámbito de la historia desde abajo, que es El Gran Pánico, y en lo que tiene que ver también con el concepto de las estructuras de sentimiento de Raymond Williams, ¿no? Es decir, al fin y al cabo, estos conceptos, que pueden ser conceptos académicos o pueden parecer a día de hoy conceptos académicos, realmente tienen que ver con empezar a pensar el cómo se construye una revolución, no desde un sujeto definido, objeto definitivo, sino al contrario, como sucede y se explica muy bien en la Hidra Revolución, es la propia lucha y el propio conflicto político y la propia materialidad del gobierno capitalista los que determinan de alguna manera los contornos de la posibilidad de la revolución y también los contornos del radicalismo que se construye en ellas, ¿no? A día de hoy sabéis que el término proletariado está encima de la mesa en muchos debates políticos. Precisamente en la Hidra de la Revolución, y no hago mucho spoiler del libro, porque imagino que todo el mundo lo comprará esta tarde o en los próximos días, se fija el momento en el que el término proletario comienza a aparecer en la literatura inglesa en el siglo XVII, ¿no? Con dos acepciones fundamentales, ¿no? La primera es las personas más humildes, desfavorecidas, las personas más viles, es decir, las personas menos integrables en el sistema, y por otro lado el término proletario como aquellas que están obligados, forzados a la reproducción y por tanto también a asumir lo más duro de lo que tiene que ver con la reproducción social. Yo creo que todos esos campos, que son muy difíciles de ver en cualquier o en la mayoría de libros de historia, que tienen que ver con una historia militante, que tienen que ver con estructuras, por ejemplo, políticas, estructuras de organización, estructuras de cultura popular, que abarcan y recorren distintos siglos, y ver en cada uno de los momentos cómo emergen con consecuencias directas. Es decir, el libro La Hidra de la Revolución, lo podréis ver, relata un sinfín de episodios revolucionarios con posibilidades de enlazarse con eso que el movimiento obrero llamaba el hilo rojo o el hilo negro, que durante siglos emergen con distintas formas organizativas y donde siempre detrás están esas ideas del radicalismo. Por ejemplo, una de las grandes líneas sería el radicalismo inglés a partir del trabajo de Christopher Hill y de Bridge Hill, que por otro lado son a las dos personas que se dedica la hidra de la revolución, ¿no? Parece que los libros de historia son cosas que te llevan al pasado y que dicen pocas cosas del presente, pero precisamente a día de hoy uno de los elementos que están en liza, y en el contexto que estamos precisamente post-15M es un elemento central, es cómo se piensa y cómo se construye y cómo se organiza una revolución donde participan culturas políticas y culturas sociales que no son las de la democracia, que no son las de la clase media, que no son las de los y las personas integradas de algún modo o con expectativas de ser integradas en el sistema. Proletario no es un sujeto que preexiste a las condiciones sociales y materiales en las que vivimos. Proletario es, de algún modo, el que se construye políticamente en las condiciones sociales y económicas en las que habitamos y tira, de alguna manera, como se ve permanentemente en el libro, de hilos de larguísimo recorrido que bueno, un poco, primero permiten entender procesos con mucha más trayectoria, con mucho más calado, y permiten también a la esperanza tener un aliento mucho más largo, saber que existen procesos, realidades culturales, realidades políticas, que una vez construidas son muy difíciles de eliminar, ya sea momentos en los que parecen que han dejado de existir, la contrarrevolución en la Revolución Inglesa, el 18 Brumario, en la Guerra Civil, en todos los ejemplos que nos queramos imaginar, pero que de algún modo, cuando ves el largo recorrido de lo que sucede, están ahí presentes, ¿no? En la hidra de la revolución, el gran sujeto revolucionario es un sujeto que en cualquier cabeza científica sería imposible. Es un sujeto formado por piratas, por revolucionarias herejes, milenaristas, por radicales ingleses que emigran, por irlandeses, por supuesto, por todas las personas esclavizadas. Yo creo que ahí es donde está el proceso de investigación que le da un enorme interés a este libro, que es un libro muy singular, que es un libro muy difícil de encontrar en el contexto español y que además es un libro que también puede ayudar a mirar la historia del Estado español desde otros puntos de vista, que es el punto de vista del proletariado entendido en esos términos tan anchos y que no se deje llevar por los dos ejes que realmente construyen la historia y la historia de las revoluciones a nuestro alrededor. Hay un tercero que entiendo que es el de la autonomía, pero los dos más mainstream, que serían el eje izquierda-derecha y el eje de lucha entre naciones históricas, por decirlo así. Existe un tercer actor, este libro habla de ese tercer actor. Nosotros y nosotras yo creo que queremos ser o queremos formar parte o ayudar a que exista ese tercer actor, que es un actor autónomo, radical y creemos de largo recorrido. No sé si esto es demasiado optimista, pero bueno, tal y como solemos empezar los septiembre, yo creo que no nos va mal ponerle un poco de optimismo. Así que nada más, le dejo la palabra a Marcus. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí y nos vemos hoy y el miércoles también. Bueno, y mañana también.
Thank you, Pablo. I don't think you left anything for me to say. Let me say, first of all, that it is a joy to be with you, that I find this place to be inspiring. I find the work that Traficantes de Sueños is doing to be extraordinarily important, and I am honored that the Many-Headed Hydra is one of your building blocks toward the future. It's an honor. I also want to say that on this date, September 11th, we are in the 50th anniversary of the United States-backed overthrow of the democratically elected government of Chile. I dare say everyone in this room knows this very well. So in solidarity with those people who suffered really unspeakable repression, and who are still to this day trying to recover the remains of their loved ones, I express my solidarity to them. Let us remember them. Okay, let me say a few more thanks. I want to say thanks to Mercedes Garcia Garmilla, who was the original translator of the Many-Headed Hydra. I would like to thank Marta Malo, who is translating tonight. Some of you are listening to her translation. And I want to thank Pablo and Emmanuel and Paco and Beatriz, who have all together made it possible for me to communicate with you. So I'm very grateful for that. So the Many-Headed Hydra. I want to talk about this book in 4 parts. The first part will be the genesis of the book, how it is that Peter Linebaugh and I came to write this book. A second theme will be the reception of the book, how the book has been viewed and reviewed by scholars and activists around the world. The third part of my talk will be the themes of the book. And then finally, I want to talk a little about the theory and the method behind the book. In other words, what are the theoretical issues that the book engages with? So let me begin with, okay, that's me and Peter Linebaugh. The two, we can see we're having a conspiracy, whispering to each other in conspiracy. I wanted to have you see Peter because he can't be here, but he is very well known to this publisher. He's been here before, he's spoken here before, and he sends to all of you comradely greetings. So Peter and I became friends many years ago, 1977, and almost immediately from our first meeting, we began to talk about the idea of writing a book together. It's kind of extraordinary when I look back on it. From the very beginning, we had the idea that we wanted to do this. But I was working on one book, he was working on another book. We didn't have time immediately. But then, in 1981, we organized a conference in Philadelphia, in the United States, on The World Turned Upside Down. Now, this is a reference to a famous book by Christopher Hill, whom Pablo mentioned, The World Turned Upside Down, Radical Ideas During the English Revolution. So our starting point was Christopher Hill and E.P. Thompson, another famous historian from below, British. Christopher Hill talked about popular radicalism in the 1640s and the 1650s. Edward Thompson picks up the story of popular radicalism in the 1790s. So Peter and I wanted to pose the question, what happened in between? What happened in between those two dates? How can we connect them? So we organized this conference in 1981. Christopher Hill was able to attend. He was in the United States at that time. We published 2 essays, and those essays became the source of what would become years later the many-headed Hydra. So it begins in 1981, really, the formal work of writing together. Now, the book was not published until the year 2000 in English. Okay, so you can see we worked on it for a very long time. Now, let me introduce to you, I've already mentioned Hill and Thompson. Oh, there are the two books, two Spanish editions. We're happy about those. And here, you might say, are our teachers. Starting at the upper left, this is E.P. Thompson. To the right, going clockwise, is Christopher Hill, two of the greatest historians of, what we might call two of the greatest historians from below. That's a phrase I'm going to use tonight, and I'll explain what I mean by it in just a few minutes. Hill and Thompson represented a specific tradition of historical writing, of radical historical writing. And Peter and I were both trained in that tradition. But moving on around the circle, you'll see at the lower right, C.L.R. James from Trinidad, lived in England for many years, a radical West Indian intellectual and writer, not an academic, an organizer, and the author of a very famous book called The Black Jacobins about the Haitian Revolution. I think one of the classics in all of history. And then moving around to the fourth person, that is the great African-American historian named W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote about the history of slavery, who wrote about the history of emancipation, wrote a brilliant book called Black Reconstruction. His book was published in 1935. James's book was published in 1938, The Black Jacobins. And here's what we wanted to do in our book. We wanted to introduce Hill and Thompson to James and Du Bois because they didn't know them. We wanted to take the depth of history from below in England and connect that to the broad international vision of the history of the African diaspora, which was not nationalist in ways that the English history was. One of our critiques of Hill and Thompson was that they worked too narrowly in English history. So we wanted greater breadth. We wanted that internationalism. So I'd say that these four figures are really crucial to the way that we understood the book that we were writing. Now, let me also say a few words about the specific conjuncture in which we first conceptualized the book. In other words, our decisions to write the book were shaped by political events all around the world. One of these was the hunger strikes waged by the IRA against British government in 1979, 1980. These were very dramatic events. I was in London at the time. Another influence was a series of riots led by Afro-Caribbean people in Great Britain. Brixton was one, in London, Toxteth, in Liverpool. These uprisings basically saying the history of the empire is still present. We're still fighting. Another very significant influence was liberation theology. The rise of base communities throughout Latin America, frequently working in tandem with radical Jesuits to defend themselves against oppressive governments. A lot of very powerful ideas and very radical interpretations of the Bible. These had a big influence. And then the fourth influence I would mention had to do with the struggles around a man that I got to know very well. You may have heard of him, a former Black Panther in the United States named Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was falsely convicted of killing a police officer in Philadelphia. in 1981, who was sentenced to death, and who, thanks to a movement that prevented his execution, he's, I'm happy to say, still alive, although still in prison. So this event was also very important to us because it was about the power of the black radical tradition in the present, in 1981. Literally, the moment we're thinking about this book. In fact, Mumia was arrested almost exactly the same day that we held that meeting in Philadelphia, less than half a mile where we were meeting. So he was much on our minds. So this is to say, the book has a genesis that is intellectual, but also political. And it was always the case, especially with James and Du Bois, that history was primarily a political undertaking. It had a more academic cast in England, but these four thinkers together really helped us to conceptualize what we were doing. Okay, so let me turn to the book itself. And there it is. And here's the first thing I want to say about the actual book. It is a wild and crazy book. There's a lot of craziness in that book. What I mean by that is that our choice of subjects was insane. Millions of workers, enslaved people, indentured servants, sailors, dock workers, market women, prostitutes, millions of workers all around the Atlantic. This is an Atlantic history over a period of 2.5 centuries, from roughly 1600 to around 1835. Okay? It's crazy to do a history of that scale, especially if you want to do history from below. That group of people, that multiracial group of people, we called the Motley Crew. And I've been trying to figure out the Spanish equivalent. Tripulación Heterogénea? Maybe there's a better translation, but you get the idea. It's a mass of multi-ethnic people thrown together, and they literally build capitalism. They build the global economic system. Okay? So the subject matter is crazy, and what is also crazy is that we worked on the book for 19 years. That's crazy. I do not recommend that to anybody who is trying to do a book. So we were both writing other books, but for the last 9 years, from basically 1991 to 2000, we did nothing but work on this book. We wrote 2,000 pages. That's also insane. But then we cut it back and cut it back and cut it back and cut it back until we had a book of more manageable size, a book that people might actually read. That was our hope anyway. Okay, so one of the big things in learning to write this book was to try to re-educate ourselves. Because Peter is trained as a British historian, and I was trained as an early American historian. And we complemented each other in that sense. He's on one side of the Atlantic and I'm on the other, but we had so much to learn. We had to educate ourselves about African history. And we especially had to educate ourselves about the history of the Caribbean. This, I think, is the hinge on which modern history turns. What happened in the Caribbean in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The establishment and the growth of the plantation system. This is a motor of capitalism for a couple of centuries. So we had a tremendous amount to learn. Now, we also had the limitations of our training, and we had the limitations of our language ability. So our Atlantic history is not fully Atlantic. We don't have much about the Spanish or Portuguese Atlantic. We have some about the French Atlantic, especially in Haiti. We don't have much about the Dutch Atlantic. We had to stick with what we knew, the sources we knew, the archives we knew. But what I want to say is there are so many other Atlantic histories to be written, and a great many of them have been written since we published this book. Some especially brilliant work on Atlantic Brazil with linkages to West Africa. Scholarship coming out of Brazil is very, very sophisticated. Okay, so let me talk for a minute about the reception of the book. The book was well viewed and reviewed, but there was one particular group of people who were profoundly hostile to the book. And I mean viciously so. And these were the gatekeepers at elite universities. Places like Yale University or Columbia University or Oxford University. Okay? These historians did everything they could to disqualify the book. They said things like, it's not really history. It is history. They said, it's too literary. It uses too much poetry. And then this is my favorite criticism, and almost all of the people opposed said this. Get this now. They said, the book overemphasizes the violence in the rise of capitalism. No, it does not. The thing is that most historians had been complicit in hiding the violence of early capitalism, so that when we pointed it out in this book, they were very threatened by this. They didn't like it at all. So our message to them was, you sanitized a very violent history to make it seem more acceptable. And we are going back into the bloodbath to show you exactly how it happened and why it happened. Okay? Now, here I want to mention a particular review by a very famous historian, David Bryan Davis, now deceased, taught at Yale University for many years. He wrote such a savage review of the book, such a vicious review, that all my friends called me up and said, what is this all about? Okay, just to give you an idea of how over the top he was, he compared Peter and me to Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. All in the same review. Right? He said, this is where this kind of history leads, to the slaughter of people. And then something really surprising happened. This very eminent Spanish historian named Josep Fontana wrote a defense of us and a counterattack against David Bryan Davis. And this was actually part of the prologue to the first edition, the first Spanish edition of the Many-Headed Hydra. I was extremely grateful to him for that. Never had the chance to meet him, I'm sorry to say. But he said, it's books like this that help history to advance. That was a wonderful thing to hear. And I am happy to report that these gatekeepers could not keep the gate closed. The book has succeeded. It's appeared in 9 or 10 different languages. And it's still being translated today. This edition here was published last year, and an edition was published in Arabic in Cairo last week. I was thrilled by this information. So that's the reception. And then let me mention one more thing about the reception. The book was in the People's Library in Zuccotti Park during the Occupy movement in 2011. till the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, brought a bunch of garbage trucks in, threw all the books into the garbage trucks, and went and dumped them in the Hudson River. So this is the kind of repression that the book has met with. The book is also banned in all prisons in the state of Texas. And this is a badge of honor. But going back to Bloomberg, I took great satisfaction in knowing that the many-headed hydra was a sea creature who would rise up out of the Hudson River to be heard from once again. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what kind of history this is. What kind of history it is. The many-headed hydra, as I'm sure most of you know, is an ancient myth. Okay, I'm going to explain it in just a few minutes. But the first challenge posed by the many-headed hydra is a challenge to the nationalist writing of history. The nation state has been the so-called natural way, the natural framework for writing history for the last 250 years in practically every nation around the world. Nationalist history, full of all the biases of nationalist history. So our challenge was to say the nationalist histories don't make sense without their international context. Right? So that's really the first thing. It was a challenge to the way most people wrote history. So it was self-consciously transnational history. History beyond the borders of the nation state. This is what we wanted to do. Specifically, class struggle beyond the boundaries of the nation state. So anti-nationalism is a methodological principle. That's a very important one. So it's not national history, and we chose Atlantic history as the framework because there's no nation in that. We didn't even like international or transnational because national is still the root word. We wanted something different. So Atlantic history, we used the name of the ocean, the great connector of all of these regions. And what we sought to do then was to link the histories of Western Europe to the histories of West Africa, to the histories of the Caribbean, to the histories of North America, and to create this sort of circle of circulation of ideas, political ideas, ideas of struggle, and to watch these things circulate beyond the nation state. So this is Atlantic history, but it's a particular kind of Atlantic history. It's Atlantic history from below. And Pablo has already said a lot about this, but this kind of history makes ordinary working people the central subjects of study. Not the great men, not the philosophers and kings and queens and statesmen and the like. They dominated history for a very long time, but this makes ordinary people, just working people, makes them the centerpiece of the history. It's their history that we want to tell. Now, we can go into this more in the discussion if you like, but I think there are 6 basic elements to writing history from below. Okay? First, it centers working people. It centers working people. 2, it is also fundamentally about the kinds of oppression that those people suffer. What kinds of oppression do they suffer? What are the power relationships that these working people are involved in? That's the second point. The third thing about history from below, you try to recapture the experience of these working people. What did they go through? What kinds of things did they live through? What kinds of resistance did they know? And then relatedly, fourth point, you want to try to understand the consciousness of these working people. In other words, they have the experience. What sense did they make of the experience? How did they understand their own experience? How did they interpret it? What concepts did they use? And so you'll notice right here, we are treating working people as thinkers, not just people who build things, although they did, but as people who think about the world and the way that it ought to be. Okay, so that's 4. The 5th thing History from Below tries to do is to recover the voices of these working people to the extent that you can. It's hard. And the big challenge to History from Below is sources, because most working people did not create very many sources of their own. This is a big challenge. And then finally, 6th and final, and this in some ways is the most important thing of all, History from Below treats, as Pablo said, treats ordinary working people as makers of history. That they didn't just experience history, they made history. And in some cases, they changed the entire course of history. So those 6 elements, working people, power, experience, consciousness, voice, and agency, those are the elements of History from Below, and those are the elements that we try to emphasize in this book. Okay, so we had some other goals in writing this book. One of the goals was to extend, to lengthen labor history. Take labor history much further back in time. Most labor history is written about the period from industrialization forward. In other words, the unstated assumption was that history begins with the factory system, and a lot of people think that begins in the early 19th century. 1820s, 1830s, factory system is growing in Europe and in the United States and in the more developed parts of the world, and that is seen as the origin of labor history. Now that privileges white male industrial workers. But white male industrial workers have always been a very small part of the working class. Very small. And by the time we were writing this book, with deindustrialization, they were getting smaller and smaller and smaller because of the flight of capital out of Europe and the United States. When I started working on sailors in the late 70s and early 80s, sailors were not even considered part of the working class because they didn't make anything. They didn't create commodities. This is a very narrow view of how wealth gets created. Without sailors, capital accumulation on a world scale can't happen. Their labor is absolutely critical. So we're fighting for a broader definition of what the working class actually is. We want enslaved people to be considered part of this Atlantic working class, or more specifically, actually, Atlantic proletariat. And I'll talk about that distinction in a minute. We want women workers to be part of this. Neither the enslaved nor women workers are waged, for the most part, but their labor is absolutely critical to capitalism. And yet somehow we had a vision of the past and of labor history that excluded the unwaged. And we thought this was a big mistake. So we wanted to write about this Atlantic proletariat. And we didn't use this in exactly the same way that Marx used the term, because he used it more or less interchangeably with industrial workers, at least some of the time in his writings. We went back to the original Roman meaning of proletariat. And do you know what it meant in ancient Rome? It meant the lowest social class, including and especially women who served the state through reproduction. In that definition, women were the original proletarians. So we wanted to make this part of our conception. Now, this term proletariat is unusual. This book is kind of a study of class formation. but of an unusual kind. An unusual kind. This Atlantic proletariat is much more diverse and multi-ethnic. Again, we're writing against the tyranny of the factory as the thing that decides what the working class is. We're going back to that original meaning of proletarian in doing so. And I might mention that this Atlantic proletariat is in some ways unmade in the 1830s when national working classes start to arise, especially in Britain, France, and the United States. So there becomes a different relationship between the waged and the unwaged. Okay, let me talk now about some concepts. And let me talk specifically about Hercules and the Hydra. Because the title of the book, The Many-Headed Hydra, literally came out of the archive and the primary sources that we studied. And here, as you know, this Hercules, the hero of ancient Greece, had to achieve 12 labors in order to become immortal. And the second of his labors was to slay the Lernaean Hydra. The problem with the Lernaean Hydra was that when Hercules, with his sword, cut off one of its necks, 2 new heads grew in its place. This was a very powerful metaphor to us. It turns out it was a very powerful metaphor to the ruling classes that were building Atlantic capitalism. And they use this metaphor all the time. And of course, they depict themselves as Hercules, right? They're Hercules. And who is the many-headed Hydra? It's this group of resistant workers who won't do what we want them to do. So we keep chopping off their heads. They keep growing back new heads. And you can find in the book and in the historical sources time and time and time again in creating the plantation system. This or that enslaver will say, it's like trying to slay the Hydra. So what was especially fascinating to us in all this is that this was an actual interpretation made by elites of their own role in the rise of capitalism, and it was a metaphor that put resistance to Hercules at the very center. Hercules is the builder of capitalism. Hydra is the force that resists it. Now, what became very interesting to us in the course of doing this work is that we began with a metaphor, right? The many-headed Hydra is a metaphor. But slowly over time, the many-headed Hydra became a concept. It became an analytical tool for understanding how history was happening. And here, I think, was the great value of it, the many-headed Hydra. This sea creature, the Hydra, captures the cooperation of diverse kinds of workers. It captures their movement. It captures their change over time. And most of all, it captures the movement of their resistance. And here's the most important thing that the concept let us do. The many-headed Hydra allowed us to think about heterogeneity or diversity or multi-ethnicity, to think about that all in the context of a unifying experience of work. Because these many heads of the Hydra had to work together. Doesn't mean they couldn't haul off and bite each other, and sometimes they did, but this showed us a way to think about the diversity of the human subjects within this revolutionary force. And we did see it as a revolutionary force. The subtitle of this book is The Revolutionary Atlantic. The people who made up this Hydra engaged in an amazing array of practices of resistance. This book studies hundreds and hundreds of revolts and mutinies and uprisings and revolutions. And you find this same historical subject at work. So thinking heterogeneity within unity is a very big thing that the Many-Headed Hydra allowed us to do. Now, one of the things we did in doing this work, we studied in the sources all of the different kinds of language of class description. Whenever we found elites reaching for new language to describe this motley crew, we made a note of it. And I'll just give you some examples. Well, the Many-Headed Hydra is one example. Hewers of wood and drawers of water. That's a biblical phrase. That's basically people who have no property who have to work for others. The outcasts of the nations of the earth. That's another phrase they use. That we have a chapter with that title. Villains of all nations, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. That's another such phrase. Motley crew. Now, what's fascinating is that once we found these phrases being used again and again and again, we went then to investigate the social and economic processes that went on behind them. Like, how do people become hewers of wood and drawers of water? How do people become the outcasts of the nations of the earth? How does that actually work? Okay, so that's one method of work. A second method is that rather than trying to begin with the class itself, in the broadest sense, our approach was to study small, self-organized groups of working people who were engaged in some kind of radical act of resistance. Radical workers. And then our method was to link those workers in that struggle to other struggles. Okay, let me give you an example. One of our chapters is about an uprising in the city of New York in 1741, where a group of Irish and African and mulatto Cuban workers, many of them sailors and soldiers, of course the enslaved, came together in a poor waterfront tavern and hatched an enormous design to capture the city of New York. They were going to do it with the help of the Spanish government because there was going to be a flotilla of Spanish privateers. These are like pirates, but they're legal. Off the coast of New York in May 1741. So the idea was Spain will attack from without, we will have an uprising from within, and we will capture the city. And you need to know that in North America at this time, Spain was seen as a liberator of enslaved people. Because if you ran away to Spanish territories, you would be given your freedom in the 18th century. This happened in Florida quite a lot. People ran away from South Carolina. So this was going to be a revolution by fire. It turns out that it failed because one of the revolutionaries made a terrible mistake and started the main fire too soon before everybody was ready. If it had gone as planned, they might have actually captured the city. And this would have changed the entire history of North America if it had happened. But again, let's look at who those people were involved in this. I'll give you the example of a man named Will. Will was an enslaved man, West African, who had been sold to New York from Antigua in the Caribbean. And before that, he had been sold to Antigua from a place in an island called Danish St. John's. Well, one of the things that came out in the trial is that Will had been involved in a major slave revolt on St. John's, in which a group of slaves captured the main fort of the city and held it for 7 months against the colonial army. In the aftermath of that, he was sold to Antigua, where he got involved in another rebellion in 1735, 1736, after which he's sold to New York, unbeknownst to the person buying him. So imagine if you're attending a meeting where people are trying to plan an uprising, and here's this guy who's got all this experience. He's been involved in these kinds of uprisings and has a lot of knowledge to impart. So there is an example. You link the uprising of New York in 1741 to a slave revolt in Antigua in 1735, another in St. John's, and you can do the same thing with the Irish soldiers who were involved in resistance against enclosure. Okay, so you start to see the method. You take an event, a fairly small group of people, and then you show that that event has very broad or Atlantic origins. Okay, a couple of points about theory. If I had to specify particular texts that were really important to us, I would say there are two parts of Capital Volume 1. First, chapters 7 and 14, which are all about the labor process. Our approach to this motley crew was to study their cooperation through work. This is critical. Study their cooperation through work. Labor, or put it this way, the work group, that's what a motley crew is, it's a work group. This is like, as a famous labor historian, David Montgomery once put it, the work group is the atom, the fundamental building block of class organization. So we wanted to study people at work. A second thing we wanted to study was what Marx writes about in chapter 28, which is so-called primitive accumulation. And this turns out to be a real key to understanding the Atlantic. Because what Marx wrote about there was the way in which small landowners or peasants or tenants lost their connection to the land in England. And as they lost their connection through enclosure, the enclosing of the common lands, the first working class was created through this mobile, swarming group of people who no longer have a place in the world. But Marx wrote about this really only in England. And that's a mistake. Because the same process goes on around the world. It is going on around the world right now. Primitive accumulation is not a stage of history. It is a continually repeated process of history whereby people are dispossessed and have nothing to sell but their labor. Turns out this is the key to understanding this Atlantic working class. So what we studied was, I'll put it to you this way, we studied expropriation. Expropriation from the land. In Europe, in West Africa, in the Caribbean, in North America, the expropriation of indigenous peoples from their land. The expropriation of West Africans from their land through the slave trade. These are all very important things. Expropriation, all of those people then go into a middle passage. This is frequently used to describe the slave trade, but everybody has a middle passage between expropriation in one place and exploitation in another. When people lose their land in the Spanish countryside and come to the city, expropriation, middle passage. The reorganization of people's labor globally is the central process of the many-headed hydra. This is what we had to try to understand. So those were two very important methods. In terms of the concepts that come out of the many-headed hydra, I think that probably the concept that has the most traction is motley crew. More and more people are using this phrase, motley crew, to try to understand the diversity within the historical subject. I have some colleagues who've done some very interesting work comparing motley crew to another concept that came out at almost exactly the same time
trying to wrestle with some of the same issues, and that was multitude. Multitude by Hart and Negri. Multitude or motley crew. We're going to have an interesting discussion about that. A second concept that came out of the book is what we call hydrarchy. There's a chapter by this title. Hydrarchy is basically from above and from below. From above, hydrarchy is the creation of blue water empires by the imperial states of Western Europe. They all create these blue water empires, and they create navies in order to manage them. That's a kind of hydrarchy from above. Hydrarchy from below is the self-organization of maritime workers, how they organize themselves. Of course, we talk at some length about pirates in this regard. Now, third concept, which is not actually named in the Many-Headed Hydra, but in many ways comes out of it. I actually, some years ago, in trying to figure out why people thought that history happens only on land and in nation states, I've always been trying to figure this out. I came up with a new word, which I called terracentrism, land-centered history. This is a bias in our modern thought, but the corollary idea is that the maritime spaces of the world are not real. They're not actually historical spaces. History doesn't happen on those spaces. History only happens in nation states, on land. And that is obviously and completely false. And yet we don't think about that enough. So one of our points in writing The Many-Headed Hydra was to think about maritime space, to think about the things that happen at sea. And of course, some very big things happen at sea. World historical processes happen at sea. Class formation happens at sea, at least a part of it. Race formation happens at sea. Multi-ethnic Africans are loaded onto slave ships. They cross the Atlantic and they are unloaded as members of a single Negro race. Race formation happens at sea. Culture formation happens at sea. All these things happen at sea, but our terracentric way of thinking blinds us to this kind of history. So to bring that back was something that we wanted to do. Another very basic principle is what I would call radical humanism. Radical humanism. A history that stresses real people, not abstractions. We've got abstractions in this book, but the abstractions, like the rise of capitalism, work through real people, making real decisions at real moments in time. Humanize historical subjects, these people who have been left out, the faceless people of history. They need to be made real. And part of making them real, as I suggested earlier, is showing that they are thinkers. I want to just briefly mention here a man who's a chapter in one of the books, a former enslaved man and sailor named Robert Wedderburn, who was an organic intellectual of the Atlantic proletariat. He had served in the Navy. He was involved in a great many different kinds of resistance. He was a thinker. He wrote a very famous book called The Horrors of Slavery, which most people paid no attention to because the author was black. Here you see his portrait on the left. Right, you can see him lecturing to a mixed race audience in what is clearly a parody of some of the mixed race political meetings of that era. But Robert Wedderburn was a thinker. So, history from below includes intellectual history from below. And as one more example of this genre, I would mention to you Carlo Ginzburg's great book, Cheese and the Worms, in which a poor man, a miller, is treated as an intellectual equal to the inquisitors who took down his heresies. Okay, and then let me just conclude this part of the talk by mentioning one thing that I don't think any reviewer has commented on about this book. The conclusion to the book sounds like an elegy, like a mournful, sad kind of summary of what's happened in the book. And Peter and I were not conscious at all that during the writing of this book, in which we saw one movement after another rise and then get defeated, and people would be hanged, and people would be burned at the stake, and people would be slaughtered. This had a very powerful impact on us. It's like mass death. This is a book about mass death, and yet there is hope because people kept fighting. No matter how much you slaughter us, we keep fighting. Okay, so let me conclude with just a few achievements of the Atlantic proletariat. As I've said, hundreds, thousands of revolts, rebellions, advancing the ideas of democracy and equality. Democracy and equality do not come from above. They do not. They are forced into the public arena, the political arena, by struggles from below. And especially important in this regard are the English, the American, the French, and the Haitian Revolution. Some examples of proletarian self-organization. The pirate ship, which we will talk about on Wednesday. Pirates were just common sailors, right? You know what they did? They seized their workplace the same way that industrial workers have done that at various times throughout history. They seized the workplace and they completely reorganized it in a much more democratic and egalitarian and less violent way. That's one instance. The first abolitionist movement is formed by the Motley Crew in the English Revolution, the 1640s and 1650s. This is going to go on to become the greatest social movement of the 19th century. A third thing, I bet you don't know that the Motley Crew also invented the strike. 1768, sailors in London, multi-ethnic sailors in London, are on strike against a wage cut, and they go around to each ship and take down the sails so that they can't leave the harbor. The technical maritime term when you take down a sail, it's called striking the sail. Strike the sail, take down the sail, ship doesn't move, capital doesn't accumulate, and the working class has a new kind of power. This was invented by sailors, basically in 1768. And then there's the red flag. Most of you probably don't know that the red flag, which has been one of the great symbols of socialism and communism since the 19th century, is originally a maritime flag. And it had a very specific maritime meaning. If a ship was in battle in the 18th century and the red flag was raised, what that meant was, we will not accept quarter, we will not surrender, and we will not allow you to surrender. We will fight to the death. Now, pirates use the red flag, and you can actually see here a red flag with a skull and crossbones. But this very powerful symbol, the red flag, a symbol of resistance, is incorporated into the labor movement in the 19th century, but its origins are Atlantic and maritime. Okay, so that's basically my talk. One more thing I'll mention, one more achievement of the Motley Crew. Motley Crew developed a broad, multi-ethnic conception of humanity. I call this enlightenment from below. There's another enlightenment besides the one we think began in France. And in order to try to recover that history, Peter Linebaugh and I went back before the modern ideas of race and class had hardened into place. And what we discovered were surprising connections. Connections that the nationalist histories had made it impossible for us to see. So our bottom line is that our history from below is older and deeper and more inspiring than we ever knew. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hay tiempo para hacer un par de rondas. Vamos a intentar coger 3 o 4 palabras ahora y devolvemos la palabra a la mesa y luego si queda tiempo pues seguimos así y aprovechamos un poco. Si levantáis la mano pasamos el micro.
Buenas tardes. Le quería hacer una pregunta a Marcus sobre el tema. Yo veo más que Hydra de la Revolución más rebelde primitivo, en el término de Hobsbawm, que revolucionarios en el término que se entiende una revolución, que es la toma del poder y el monopolio y controlar el monopolio de la violencia. Y también, otra pregunta es, ¿cuál sería el proyecto social de esta Hydra?
I have a question about specifically pirate forms of organization and sailors and the sort of social movements that were starting in England, like with the levelers and the diggers and the antinomians, all the religious movements and all that. Is there a direct link between new forms of organization and members of these social movements having been kicked out of, like expropriated, like you say, and ending up in ships, eventually pirate ships, or striking, like you just showed?
Bueno, mi pregunta iba si cómo podemos conectar todos estos movimientos, ¿no?, de resistencia y de rebelión con los momentos de la historia, con las experiencias que realmente sí que triunfaron, como puede ser, por ejemplo, el caso de la Unión Soviética. Me ha recordado muchísimo toda la cuestión de los piratas y tal, por ejemplo, a los marineros del Potemkin al inicio de la revolución, y cómo vincular esa experiencia, toda la experiencia de todas estas rebeliones, con esos momentos que sí que triunfaron, que realmente como que sí que pueden estar en el mismo, utilizando los mismos términos, utilizando el mismo bagaje común, y eso, cómo unir eso.
¿Está la gente tímida?
Okay. Is Marta still translating? Okay, thank you for the question about primitive rebels. I am happy to say I knew Eric Hobsbawm. I studied his work. I thought and think very highly of him. But my question about primitive rebels is to ask or to say it really wasn't primitive. It was only primitive by comparison to some ideal way of waging politics, which you're using retrospectively to judge whether people were primitive or modern. Okay, so I think that these rebels were much more sophisticated than we have known. And one of the reasons why is that we haven't done enough history from below yet. We haven't studied all of their thoughts. I'll just mention another book that I wrote was about a working class man named Benjamin Lay, who was a Quaker, who became one of the first people to demand the worldwide abolition of slavery. How did he make this breakthrough when throughout Europe, everybody, almost everybody, considered slavery to be a perfectly natural institution? So again, we need to think about these people as thinkers, and we'll find that there are a lot of very important things that we can learn from them. With regard to your second question about the means of violence, not sure I understood that completely. There was a question about the monopoly of state violence. Okay, well, I'd say that for the most part, in the period that we studied, resistance usually took the forms of counter-violence. That was certainly true of pirates. Pirates completely rejected the state's monopoly on violence, and they're sailing around these very powerful warships. So they're going to fight back. The question is, what kinds of weapons do people have to fight back with? This is a kind of interesting question. And the weapons they have to fight back with are not nearly as deadly as the weapons they're facing. So there's a great imbalance there. But I think the idea of nonviolent resistance comes later. Not really a part of the project. People thought that to make change and to wage revolution, it was going to require physical fight. With regard to the question about the linkages between the radical groups and the English Revolution and pirates, there are a surprising number of specific linkages. Christopher Hill wrote a short essay about this called Radical Pirates. And there's a new book by David Graeber, whom I know you publish. Do you plan to bring out Libertalia? Yeah, it's about pirates. Yeah. In that book, David Graeber talks very specifically about how radical ideas that went back to the 17th century were brought ashore in Madagascar by pirates and then became part of a new social order in that part of the world. And one of the most significant things they did was a body of water that the pirates named Ranter Bay. And the Ranters, as you know, were one of the radical groups in the English Revolution. We also have evidence of people on board of pirate ships wearing what were described as the faded red coats of the New Model Army. The New Model Army was the parliamentary army, which had all kinds of radicalism in it, and so some of these people were expropriated, shipped to the New World. We also have other religious radicals taking part in revolts against slavery in Virginia. So if you search, you will find those connections. And the third question about connecting different revolutionary moments streams. You know, one of the things that's so hard about this maritime tradition of radicalism is that it disappears from view because it disappears from documentation, but that doesn't mean that it's gone in the lives and actions of the people. And I'll just give you one example. The pirates are defeated in 1726. Their ideas are driven, I was going to say underground, but maybe below deck is better. The same ideas emerge in the American Revolution in the 1760s, and the same ideas emerge again in the 1790s with this massive explosion of mutiny in the navies of the world. So can you go year by year and see that maritime tradition of radicalism? No, you can't see it. But when it pops up again, you know that there's some continuity. So by comparing things, and then you bring up the Russian Revolution. I'm not aware of a study that actually goes into this question, but I think a lot of the sailors who were staunch revolutionaries had international experience and connections to other revolutionary movements. So again, we need more history from below. There's a lot to be learned, still to be learned on these subjects. And then let me just mention one more thing. You know, there's defeat, and then there's defeat. And not all defeats are the same. And I would mention here a poem by the great radical American poet Thomas McGrath, in which he describes one defeat after another defeat after another defeat after another defeat, but each defeat is better than the one before, and finally the defeat leads to a breakthrough and revolution. So be careful when you describe a defeat. There may be things within it that can help you build for the next round.
Quería preguntar, siguiendo un poco el hilo de la historia intelectual, de las ideas, digamos, historizada a través de la vida cotidiana de los trabajadores en la historia, se me ocurría, leyendo tus libros, cómo podemos conectar o si podría ser plausible entender el surgimiento de conceptos intelectuales como el concepto de la totalidad, tan importante para el marxismo y para el movimiento obrero en un sentido intelectual y político, en un nivel, digamos, ontológico, cómo puede conectarse eso con la estructura de plausibilidad de ese concepto de totalidad que podría estar en esa clase de trabajadores que son por sí mismos una conexión, ¿no? que están en el mar y que tienen ellos mismos ese papel de conexión internacional, ¿no? y que en el mar su labor cotidiana es precisamente esa construcción literal de la totalidad que es el entramado social capitalista de la modernidad primera, ¿no? Y si hay si se puede trazar este camino intelectual a través de la historia de las ideas por esa ontologización del trabajo que está en los propios trabajadores y en la formación de la clase de la primera modernidad que has estudiado.
Go ahead. Okay, thank you for this question. As I said, the biggest challenge for writing intellectual history from below is sources, because many workers don't leave records, especially first-person records of their thoughts. So we must be very creative in trying to find those records. And I'll just give you a personal example. When I first started my research on sailors, I had very learned professors who told me that I was going to fail because I wouldn't find any evidence about them. And being naturally hard-headed, I didn't listen to them, and I went searching. And one of the things I found, which is actually important, I think, for all history from below, the history of working class people is frequently embodied in legal documents because working class people are frequently on the wrong side of the law. So I started studying records created in the High Court of Admiralty in England. Cases about mutiny, cases about piracy, cases about murder, wage disputes. And then the most remarkable thing happened. I get into these sources, and they're filled with statements by sailors explaining what they think happened and why. It's their own voice. A scribe in the courtroom is taking it down. So I could hear them speak in their own voice. And every time something goes wrong at sea, the sailor will give his version of what a proper ship should work like. So you can get a sense of the normative, you can get a sense of their ideal of what a ship actually could be. So were those people fighting the capitalist totality? Probably not. I don't think they had that language. But they did understand that they were up against a big global system of commerce. And they did understand that very wealthy people ran that system. And they did understand that those people did not have their interests as sailors at heart. So they carry on this kind of constant struggle beneath our vision most of the time. But then sometimes it erupts. You see more of it. You see what was down there all along, like the strike. The strike comes up. So I think this is the way we have to approach this kind of thing. We can't think of people as philosophers unless they actually wrote some works of their own, and some people did. Some workers did. Quite a few of them wrote very interesting autobiographies that are quite philosophical. This man I mentioned, Benjamin Lay, did that. Wrote a really strange book, but it's full of his political thoughts about how the world should be organized. So can we then make this part of a new, broader intellectual history? Definitely. And we have an example, to go back to the question that was raised about the levelers and the diggers and the seekers and the ranters. Before Christopher Hill's book, The World Turned Upside Down, those people were just considered to be crazy eccentrics. Now they are part of the intellectual history of the English Revolution. All historians regard them as very important. So we have to wage a historiographical battle. We have to demonstrate the importance of these thinkers from below in order to make the mainstream historians say, oh, well, that relates to the story that we're studying. That's how you make progress, by forcing people to take account of these historical subjects they left out. And I think that has happened and is still happening.
¿Alguien más anima a hacer una pregunta?
Well, first, I really liked your book. Thought it was very fresh and interesting. But I was left thinking that at some point you said there was a draft that was about 2,000 pages, and so I was a bit curious about whether what other realities or political actors you left out that you feel a bit like, I wish they were in there?
Yeah. Good question. Well, I'll just give you one example. There were many kinds of research that got cut out. And one thing that got cut out was I was studying advertisements placed in colonial newspapers for enslaved people who had run away from their enslavers. And I was really taken by how many of them got on board of ships. Because the person who placed the ad would say, masters of vessels are warned, don't let these people on board your ship because they will try to escape. And that is repeated again and again and again and again. And I found this one figure in particular, a man named Caesar. At least that was the name his enslaver gave him. We'll never know his African name. And he ran away. He was a ferryman. He worked on a ferry taking people back and forth across rivers. He apparently was recaptured because then he ran away again 10 years ago. And the most extraordinary thing about Caesar is that he didn't have any legs. A runaway with no legs. Now, how do you do that? I was fascinated. But it turns out we didn't put that body of research into the book. So that got cut out. So now I'm writing a book about those people. So it took me a lot of years from 2000 to come back around to the subject, but now I'm writing a book about escaping slavery by sea. So in some ways, the many-headed hydra continues to determine my research agenda. And this is the way it is with History from Below. Everybody should have a file that says, things I found while I was looking for something else. Because those are sometimes the most fascinating things, and they can lead you into new subjects and new insights.
Hola. Si podrías comentar algo sobre la relación con las creencias religiosas y los movimientos de lucha, porque al leer a día de hoy el libro, pues llama mucho la atención la fuerte religiosidad de los movimientos de la época, y actualmente obviamente pues tenemos en los movimientos de lucha en Europa especialmente pues un rechazo a las creencias religiosas, ¿no? Y tenemos una tradición más de unas creencias más científicas o discursos o retóricas más científicas por el materialismo científico, etcétera. ¿Cómo consideras a día de hoy esta relación entre las luchas y las creencias religiosas en nuestros movimientos?
Excellent question. Thank you. And it is true that in order to understand the radicalism that we were studying, we had to go beyond the idea that religion is the opiate of the masses. All those groups in the English Revolution, levelers, diggers, seekers, ranters, Quakers, were all very religious and all advanced very radical ideas. Turns out liberation theology is much older than we thought. And one of the things I discussed with Christopher Hill was how liberation theologians in the 1970s and 1980s were studying the same parts of the Bible as the radicals of the 17th century. So religion can take powerful radical form. It can take a powerful reactionary form. The reactionary form has been dominant around the world in recent years, and I dare say it still is. But it's also true that the Bible is full of radical ideas. There are people who are working with those ideas to change. And I think, see, here's another thing about History from Below. You have to learn to listen. have to put aside your preconceptions of what something means and really listen carefully to what someone is saying or writing. This man I studied, Benjamin Lay, fiercely religious, but he was probably the most radical single person I have ever discovered in all of my studies. He was class conscious, he was race conscious, he was gender conscious, he was environmentally conscious, he was a vegan 200 years before the word was invented, he championed animal rights. This man had an unbelievably radical worldview. I called him the most radical person on the planet. And his Quaker beliefs were at the heart of all of it. So we have to study the different forms of radicalism and see how they connect to each other and how they connect to other movements.
Bueno, ¿alguna pregunta más o si no lo vamos a dejar aquí? Recordar que mañana a las 7 estaremos con la historiadora Wendy Goldman, que estará presentando su libro Estado, Revolución, Mujer, Estado y Revolución, que es un ensayo sobre historia durante los primeros 20 años de la Revolución Rusa. Mañana a las 7 aquí. El miércoles tendremos una segunda sesión con Marcus sobre villanos de todas las naciones. Y nada, agradecer también a Marta por el trabajo y el curro de traducción simultánea y nada, muchas gracias a Marcus, a Pablo y a todos.